This week, the Communicators begins a four-part series on U.S. cybersecurity. White House Cybersecurity Coordinator Howard Schmidt is this week's guest, and he's interviewed about the Obama administration's effort to reduce cyber threats and to protect the U.S. against cyber attacks.
Well, this is week one in the Communicators' four-week series on cybersecurity, cyber threats, and legislative proposals to address those cyber threats. We're pleased to be joined on our first week by Howard Schmidt, Assistant to the President and also White House Cybersecurity Coordinator. Guest reporter Siobhan Gorman, Intelligence Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Schmidt, if we could start, though, before we dive into the proposals that the Obama administration has put forward on cybersecurity, is there a working definition of what cybersecurity is across governments and across the different stakeholders, of what it is and what it will entail?
I think the term that we use and approach in what we now call cybersecurity has evolved over the years. It used to be called computer security, then it was information security, then it was information assurance, and now we've sort of coalesced around cybersecurity because it encompasses everything from end-user devices such as smartphones all the way up to and including government systems and defense systems. So we've pretty much gone around that from a government perspective. Internationally, we see other governments that take different terms. They use information security still. They look at issues around computer security. So locally, we've got it. Internationally, it's not the same.
Is it a global issue?
It is very much a global issue, and I think that's why not only are we paying a lot of attention to it within the U.S. government and private sector, but the economics of the world has turned around on the technology backbone that we see today, and a lot of this hinges on how well we do security.
In the last couple of months, the White House has released a series of cybersecurity proposals, some legislative. How would you encapsulate those proposals?
Well, I think they're a continuation of what the President asked us to do in May of 2009, where he released a cyberspace policy review and said there's some really specific things we need to look at. One of them, of course, is the April release of the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, looking at identity and how we do that and how do you get trusted identities. The second one, of course, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit, is about the legislative piece. What are the things that Congress can do to help not only U.S. government, but U.S. businesses? And the third one, which is sort of the cornerstone of a lot of what we're looking at, is the President's international strategy on cyberspace. And note that it's a cyberspace strategy, not a cybersecurity, because the subtitle is prosperity and economy in a sort of a technical world that we live in today.
Siobhan Gorman.
Well, I'm wondering if we could just do one more sort of stage-setting question. If you can characterize, because we're seeing almost on a daily or at least weekly basis, new evidence of cyber infiltrations, attacks, things like that. I mean, how do you, when you look across the board, whether it's state-based, cybercrime, et cetera, how do you characterize the threat that the United States is facing in cyberspace right now?
I think I characterize it in a couple of places. One, you have to bucket it in the correct areas. You mentioned cybercrime. Clearly, we've seen cybercrime ever since we moved from bulletin board systems to the internet to the web and e-commerce, that there's been concentrated efforts by criminals out there to take advantage of that. So that's one piece that we continue to see. That, of course, increases. The more we become dependent on IT systems, the more people are engaging in it, the more opportunities the criminal to operate in cyberspace. On the other end of the spectrum, we start looking at the dependency that we have as a government and as a civil society. The lights are on because somewhere there's an IT system running a power generating system. So therefore, because that dependency exists, any threats against those systems have a more dramatic effect on us, which is why we're getting more focused on identifying what's going on out there, trying to isolate what exactly the impact's going to be, but more importantly is how do we stop it from happening.
One thing that has intrigued me is that different corners of the government seem to have different views on how severe the threat is. And one of your jobs is obviously to coordinate these differing views. But one of the most vocal components of the government on the cyber threat has been the Pentagon. I mean, with officials warning of a cyber Pearl Harbor and things like that. And yet, a lot of times in your comments, I don't necessarily see that sort of approach taken. And I'm wondering how publicly we're supposed to assimilate different views across the administration in terms of how severe the threat is.
Well, when you look at the different parts of government that have different responsibilities, the Department of Defense is responsible for looking at the worst case scenario and doing what they can to protect the United States and our interest against that. Whereas you look at other parts of the government, Commerce, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, Department of Treasury, who all have different responsibilities and see it through their lens. And you're absolutely correct. When the President created this office, the idea was to coordinate these and develop good policy that the President could put forth on behalf of the U.S. government.
What do we make, though, of the Pentagon's much stronger statements about the cyber threat? I mean, if you liken it to concerns about a cyber Pearl Harbor, or, you know, just when they talk about the millions of scans that are done of defense systems every day.
Yeah, and I would say it's not, not necessarily only the defense systems that are scanned.
Right.
We have, private sector, we have other parts of the government, including other governments. And what it is, when we hear what they say, we have to take that as part of the overall picture we look at, take that into account, figure out what they can do to help, how much is it directly related to defense activities, how much of it goes to the FBI, Department of Justice, Secret Service, how much goes to Homeland Security. But this is part of an overall picture, but not the whole picture.
We alluded a little bit earlier, obviously, to the White House's cybersecurity legislative proposal, and I'm wondering, perhaps now that we're over the debt crisis, if we're going to see a little bit more action. In speaking with people on Capitol Hill, I've heard a lot of fears, at least from aides who have been working hard on this issue, that things have kind of stalled out. So can you give us a little bit of an update? Yeah,
and we, like you just mentioned, believe that we're going to start seeing some movement on this when the Congress comes back. This has been a big issue. We recognize there's a whole lot of pieces that we need to put in place on this. Legislative is only one of that. Now, while this has been up there since we've submitted the proposal on behalf of the President, that doesn't mean we've just stopped all work waiting for Congress to do something. We continue to make efforts, but we think when Congress comes back, there'll be extra focus on it, both not only in the Senate, but also on the House, and we'll see a continued movement forward on a bipartisan basis, recognizing that there's pieces of cybersecurity that I think the legislative body can help us with.
Mr. Schmidt, you talked about pieces of cybersecurity legislation. Right. Would you prefer to see a whole package passed, or would you like it in bits and pieces? Yeah,
we submitted what we consider to be a comprehensive package based on requests from Senator Reid, and we think that's the important way to look at it, because when we start looking just at the process of getting things through Congress, if we have small bite chunks that we're dealing with, it's going to take a lot longer than I think any of us want to see happen. So this way, looking at it from a perspective of here's the pieces that we need to put in place, let's put them all in place at one time, and then continue to evaluate things as we move forward. If we need more in the future because technology changes, the threat changes, then we can adjust them in the future. But looking at it as a comprehensive fashion is, I think, the way forward now.
If Congress doesn't look at it that way, which one piece do you think is critical to get passed ASAP?
I think the biggest one is the part where information sharing with the private sector, particularly the critical infrastructure, and the role of the U.S. government in there. We've long debated about what is government's role, what is private sector's role, how much interaction there should be. Private sector's been saying for a long time that there's a lot of things they can do on their own, but the government has some unique information based on intelligence, law enforcement investigations, other activities. They really need that. So those are the two pieces that we really, really need to make sure we get that locked down so we can mutually sort of accept that shared responsibility we have to protect the critical infrastructure.
What have you been doing to work with private industry on this? Because in talking with people on Capitol Hill about kind of the prospects for this legislation, I've heard that there's been considerable pushback from private industry, not just the Chamber of Commerce, but telecommunications companies, some technology companies aren't fans of the sort of system that your proposal and that other proposals on the Hill would set up to kind of require certain parts of critical infrastructure to evaluate their systems and kind of report back on that. And I'm wondering how the White House is managing industry's concerns on this.
Right. I think there's a couple things. One is we've said when we rolled out the proposed legislation, this is the beginning of the dialogue. This is by no means the end of the dialogue. Secondly, as we work with the private sector, not only the White House, but also all the departments and agencies that have a sector-specific responsibility, getting feedback with the private sector and shaping what is it that we really need to do and what are the things that they need. I don't know that I would characterize the private sector response as being tremendous pushback. There's concerns about
one person characterized it to me as they came out with guns blazing. So some of the folks getting feedback on Capitol Hill described it as significant.
Yeah, and I think the vast majority of the people I talk to say that it seems to be very measured. They want to understand the devil's in the details. We need to figure that out. We need to define what exactly is critical infrastructure. What is that reporting mechanism? We want to make sure that if somebody has a particular reporting requirement now to some government agency, that we're not piling something else on top of them. Those are the concerns I've heard with the private sector, which, by the way, are shared concerns that we have. As we get into the details, we need to make sure we continue to continue the economic growth that IT and technology gives us, while still making sure that the lights stay on and we have the ability to communicate.
Would you anticipate any changes being made to that portion of it, given that that's kind of the section that seems like both the guts of the legislative proposal and also the thing that's causing heartburn, at least among some in industry?
Yeah, I would think as this moves forward, there'll be further input from private sector. Congress, as they get more coalesced on what are the details in this thing, will work together, and we anticipate changes. And we expect them to come back with some of the proposed changes so we can provide feedback on how workable we think that is under the current set of situations we're living under now.
And Mr. Schmidt, on May 27th in the Wall Street Journal, an article by Siobhan Gorman, she quoted an internal Chamber of Commerce document that said this: layering new regulations on critical infrastructure will harm public-private partnerships, cost industry substantial sums, and not necessarily improve national security.
And it's interesting because we read that article, needless to say, and I've had a number of conversations with the Chamber, and basically as they try to bear in mind that there are a number of different companies and organizations with different perspective. So as they're trying to, and that was a draft, it was not fully vetted with the other members. So basically that getting out there was not quite fully representative of the position on the Chamber itself and what they've told me. We continue to be sensitive to their needs. We continue to hope that they work together internally to figure out what are the alternatives that can not only, once again, continue the business needs that we have out there while also improving security.
I want to read one other quote to you, if I may, sir. Josh Corman of the 451 Group, quoted in the Huffington Post on May 13th after the White House cybersecurity proposals came out. The attackers are 2 years ahead of the defenders, security vendors, who are 2 years ahead of the market, which is 2 years ahead of compliance, and legislation is 5 years behind that. How do you keep up?
Well, it's the thing when you start looking at how do you define being ahead of someone. I get that question all the time. We are better now than we were last year. We're better prepared. We've got better processes not only within the government but outside the government. But the vulnerabilities that we've had for years still exist. And the bad guys, the bad actors, still exploit those same vulnerabilities over and over again. Typical thing that we see through sort of the anatomy of, or the autopsy of one of these sort of events. You have a phishing email exploiting a known vulnerability, which gives somebody the escalate privilege. We've seen that for the past 20 years. So I don't know that anybody's ahead. We all recognize it. It's doing that basic hygiene that we're looking at. Legislatively, as we pointed out in the proposal that we put forward, there are some things that we need to catch up on. The penalties for impacting critical infrastructure, the impact on organized crime, which is now part of this cybercrime thing that we talked about a few moments ago. So updating that is key, but I don't know that I'd put 2 years, 2 years, or 2 years. We recognize there's some ground that we have to make up.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Kicking off today, we are doing a 4-week series on cybersecurity and cyber threats. Howard Schmidt, Cybersecurity Coordinator for the White House and Assistant to the President, is our guest. Siobhan Gorman, Intelligence Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, is our guest reporter.
One of the other issues that has come up, obviously, in the legislative proposal is the White House puts a lot of stock in the role of the Department of Homeland Security. And I've talked with some lawmakers who have some hesitation about that because they feel that DHS is still even nearly a decade old, not quite yet, still kind of a young agency, and cybersecurity is an even newer responsibility for it, whereas agencies like the National Security Agency have been doing this for decades. And I'm just wondering, why focus so much on the Department of Homeland Security, and how are you responding to concerns from lawmakers? Because I understand that this comes up from time to time in discussions with the administration.
First, when we look at the roles of different parts of government, you mentioned the Department of Defense National Security Agency, which for long has had great technical capabilities. I've said many times, if I need someone to help protect the system, they're the folks that I would go to. But when you look at the civilian responsibilities across the Homeland Security, you look at the things have been put in place for Homeland Security in a relationship with the private sector, they're the best place to put it. Drawing on the other resources within the government, drawing within the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Justice, and FBI. So it's a supportive role, but somebody has to lead this. As a consequence, as they continue to build their capabilities, as we develop the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, we look at things such as Cyberstorm, which are some of the exercises. That better gives them a window into some of the things that they have to modify and change to do this. So I have confidence in the leadership, I have confidence in the mission that they've got, but we continue to build the capabilities with smart people and good laws put in place to help support them.
Can they do it fast enough, though? Because, I mean, as we were just discussing, this is something where government's response to the threat has been rather slow. And so if you're adding sort of a learning curve for an agency on top of that, I mean, can the government, can the department respond quickly enough to this threat? I
think they can, and it's the type of thing where it's more than their responsibility. I mean, private sector is a big part of this. Private sector's been dealing it for a long time. So as a consequence, the ability to ramp up to deal with what we're dealing with today is ongoing work, but more importantly is building for the future. Because the idea is part of their role will not only dealing with the things we deal with today, but how do we wind up making sure that private sector is better organized, the government's better organized, and we're sending a clear message to those that would try to disrupt our systems that there are consequences for this. So yes, it's a learning, I wouldn't even say it's a learning curve. It's a building of capacity, but they're not the only ones in the world that have to deal with that.
Mr. Schmidt, James Lewis, who I think worked with you on this report of CSIS, saw a quote by him saying that asking private enterprise to help protect cybersecurity systems is like asking the airlines to protect the U.S. from air attack. What's your response to that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that's a valid characterization. When you look at, number one, if you just boil it down just to the business needs, I think we've recognized in business over the past 5 years that there's a business imperative. Security is just not a luxury. It's just something that you need to do. It's part of a business process. It's building that into the systems and still having an open system so we can do online transactions to be able to coordinate with our business partners and everything is sort of, once again, it's a new thing. This is a brand new technology that we've been pushing out to the boundaries with. So asking them to do it, they have an inherent need to do that to make their businesses successful. You know, people talk all the time about power stations and all these other things. They don't make money if the lights aren't on. Businesses don't make money if indeed their products can't be sold securely. So there's a business imperative for them to do it as well. There's some that are slow to coming to the table to fully recognize their role in critical infrastructure, but clearly they're getting smarter about it. And part of our job, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, is to make sure they understand that they have a shared responsibility as well.
At what point does it exceed their responsibility, though? I mean, one of the things the Pentagon is most concerned about is that they're reliant on the same power grid that all of us are, and if the lights go out, it affects them just as much as it's going to affect, you know, the hospital next door or whomever. I mean, when is a cyber attack actually an act of war, use of force, whatever terminology we'd use, but something where it starts to go into the military realm?
Well, and that's one of the things we continue to debate with really smart lawyers. You know, if you look at the President's International Cyberspace Strategy we put out, and the part in there about the ability to respond in like, hopefully we'll never see that. There's been a lot of discussion about putting labels associated with cyber intrusions, denial of service attacks, these sort of things. And we continue to look at what is that escalation point. But to your point specifically about the dependency the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, or any government has on those resources, we have a mechanism, which is part of the proposal, the legislation, is to say, prove to us that you can do this. Prove to us that you are set up to deal with most things that get thrown at you. And if not, what are you going to do to fix it? And it's almost, you know, and it sounds like in some cases a silly discussion, but how do we deal with a, you know, major snowstorm and we're shut down for days and days and days? We have processes in place to deal with that, the unexpected. We have to do the same thing in the critical infrastructure realm as well.
But even as the lawyers debate this notion of what an act of war would be, I mean, you've now studied this problem for decades. What's your sense of it?
I think if we ever get to a point where it's military against military or military against civilian structures, then that sort of flips the switch the other way. And it's not to say it's automatically you turn the switch back and become military. You have diplomatic, you have economic, you have all kinds of pieces which the President's laid out in his strategy to deal with those sort of things. But that's sort of the worst case scenario.
So is that if the U.S. can prove that some other country's military actually attacked? Because, I mean, proving that a specific government, much less their military, is responsible is something that is really difficult to do. I mean, that almost seems like, I'm not sure when you would prove that.
Well, and that's the thing. When you look at attribution, number one, I think it's just foolhardy of any government to do something like that because they're going to be affected by it as well. And we've talked about that before because it's in nobody's interest to create some sort of a cyber Armageddon, as people say, or a digital Pearl Harbor. But on the same token, that's why we have to be very careful in analyzing everything that we see take place, every intrusion, every distributed denial of service attack, every theft of passwords, every one of those scans that you mentioned, to analyze them and see, do these rise to the level of being a threat to the U.S. or the U.S. interest? And if so, how do we deal with them? A lot of this, as I mentioned earlier, goes about just basic hygiene and making sure that these things that we know are out there just can't affect us.
Howard Schmidt is currently the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator and Special Assistant to the President, but I got to tell you, Mr. Schmidt has had one of the most intriguing careers that I've ever seen. I would suggest you go to the White House website in case you'd like to look at it further. But he served in Vietnam with the Air Force. He worked as a policeman in Chandler, Arizona. He worked for the FBI at the National Drug Intelligence Center. He was a special advisor for cyberspace security for the White House Chief Security for the White House. Under the George W. Bush administration, he was vice chair of the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board. He served as with Microsoft as well, and that's just a couple of the things. He's gotten both his BA and MBA from the University of Phoenix. Mr. Schmidt, one of the proposals that the President calls for is that this needs to be coordinated from the White House. Right. Do you see this as a cybersecurity czar type position who coordinates this activity?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a czar. Truly, the term coordinator is what this job is all about. And interestingly enough, and very positive, we've seen very similar states around the world do similar type things, recognizing there is the defense side, the intelligence side, the commerce side, that there needs to be somebody sort of bringing those things together, getting the input from everybody, and making good advice to, in our case, the President. In other countries, the Prime Minister or President's there as well. So clearly, it has to be anchored in the White House, as the President is put forth.
Are there any funding numbers in place for this?
As far as the White House or broadly?
In just cybersecurity in general.
Yeah, and we do have some things that go back to the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, the CNCI, where some money is allocated for that. But once again, as we evolve in cybersecurity, one of the things we look at was cybersecurity cost, and that would be antivirus or firewalls, these sort of things. Well, no longer are they viewed as strictly security type things. They're part of the infrastructure. It's just like when we buy a car today, we don't say, gee, I want to have brakes or not have brakes. It's just part of the safeties we build in now. And that's why when we look at the IT infrastructure, the security's got to be built into it.
Just looking at your office, one of the things that is, one of the proposals that's still circulating on the Hill is to sort of create more structure around your position. And I'm wondering, now that you've obviously had some time to spend in that position, I mean, what is your take in terms of proposals that would either give it more control over the purse strings or just sort of establish your office more kind of grounded in statute?
Well, first, having control of purse strings doesn't necessarily make you more secure. We've seen that with the evolution of FISMA and most recently some of the changes we've made to FISMA to make that work. The structure we have now, I think, is a good structure. We have the ability to bring all the leadership from all the departments and agencies into one room and go through these tough issues. Who handles what, how it gets handled, what are the policies that we need to do, what are the legislative piece. So I think by virtue of the fact that we've been able to accomplish so much in such a short period of time for cybersecurity sort of lends some credence to the fact that I think we're well structured. Plus, and it wasn't mentioned earlier, when the President created this position, it was not only part of the National Security Council, but also dual hat at the National Economic Council, which once again I think is vitally important because our economy deals so much with cybersecurity and the technology.
What's the hardest issue that you've had to sort out among the agencies so far?
Well, I think what you mentioned at the very beginning, where you have great expertise in different areas, looking at it very specifically from their area, which is what we want them to do, and getting people to sort of come together with a consensus of what are the things we need to do, we need to fix right now. Moving away from the edges, like we've seen in so many venues recently, and getting to move to the middle says, how can we move this forward?
So what are you hearing from Congress?
Well, the meetings we've had with Congress, and on the heels of us submitting the President's proposal, we're getting a lot of good feedback that they welcome the opportunity to debate this more deeply within Congress. They look forward to us providing some input as to what are the things we really need. I think the last count when we first submitted this, there were some odd 50 some odd pieces of proposed legislation across 26 committees. All of them very well intended, all of them exercising jurisdiction, but had not heard from us saying, what are the things that you guys really need? And that's what we put forth, and they're very happy to get that. As we mentioned earlier, though, the debate's going to start here when Congress comes back and really get into the details of this and how it's going to best work.
Given the realities of about 3 months or so of legislative season left this year,
Right.
Do you foresee anything happening?
I do. I'm very confident because there seems to be a commitment from leadership up there that says, yes, now that we've got this big issue behind us right now, we can start focusing on this because they all recognize we need to do things. And those things are part of the proposed legislation we put forward, and we need to move them forward. So I feel very confident they'll be moving this forward as soon as they get back.
Have you gotten a commitment from Republicans to move on this? Because that was one of the things I was hearing on the Hill, was there was concern that you know, the Republicans had other priorities and this wasn't necessarily going to be at the front burner.
Yeah, and my conversation have not been partisan at all. I meet with members of both parties. They've all committed. They recognize we need to do more, and it's a matter of getting educated on it and figuring out a way forward. So I see no break in which side of the aisle is going to be working with us on this.
And you think that they're actually going to have time to pass legislation in the next few months?
I do. I feel very good because they recognize how critical this is to so many different pieces of what we look across the United States.
Mr. Schmidt, we have not talked about the privacy concerns of some groups. The Electronic Privacy Information Center, which will be a guest in this series a little later in a couple of weeks. This is a quote by Mark Rotenberg looking at the White House proposal. There should be legal standards, not voluntary guidelines when it comes to controls on privacy.
Yeah, and one of the things we did, not only for the legislature, but also any of the other works we've done, we're very deeply engaged with the privacy and civil liberties community. If you read through the President's International Cyberspace strategy, it has had in many, many places references to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, privacy, civil liberties when it comes to cyberspace. So that's one of the core tenets that we have in what we're doing, even to the point where the President has a dedicated privacy officer in my office to look across the broad swath of areas. But when Mark or anybody from CDT or any other privacy agencies look at this, we want to make sure that they have the confidence that we're focusing on it, that we have controls in place to make sure that we're protecting privacy and civil liberties, and it's something we're accountable for, something that's transparent to whatever organization wants to look at it. I think we're doing that. We'll continue as we move forward with the legislation to make sure that this takes place. The other piece, when we look at one of the other proposals, is the data breach notification. There's two pieces to that when we look at a national breach notification law. One is citizens, oftentimes we're not sure what our rights are when it comes to our information being compromised that's in the hands of a third party. On the same token, businesses that have that information are, dealing with 47 odd pieces of legislation from different states on it's encrypted, not encrypted, we think something happened. So once again, I think we help vulcanize a little bit more on the privacy, this proposal with the national data breach notification.
How do you make this user friendly?
Well, that's one of the tough things, and security's got to be transparent to the end user. And when I say end user, it's just not any of us sitting in front of a computer. It's the small, medium-sized businesses. When you look across the United States, 27+ million businesses are doing things online. We saw even during the economic problems we had a couple years ago, we saw a tremendous increase in the billions of dollars in online e-commerce. So it's got to be transparent, it's got to be user-friendly, and the end user should not be the one saddled with, is this good or is this bad? We should have mechanisms in place as businesses, as governments, to make sure you're not confronted with that, and that's part of what these proposals will help lead to.
The flip side to the privacy concerns are the critics who say that the White House's proposal didn't go far enough, that it was just sort of creating a voluntary set of standards for business, particularly critical infrastructure. And they say, you know, well, if this is truly infrastructure that's critical to our security, why isn't the government just simply telling them what they need to do in order to, you know, protect national security? I mean, what do you say to the people who raise those concerns that, you know, this isn't really that enforceable?
And if it was strictly voluntarily and nobody else cared about it, I'd probably have that same concern. But those same businesses I mentioned earlier, they have business needs to do better security. They know that they're doing business with the government or other companies hinge on how well they can do attestation that they're doing the right thing. So once again, there's an imperative for them to do it.
But that imperative has existed now for many years, and I think everyone acknowledges at this point that it hasn't gotten the country to where it needs to be, because otherwise we wouldn't need to be doing all of this.
And I agree, but I don't think the awareness has been there. The business need has been there. It's sort of been, let's build it, roll it out, and then secure it later on. I think there's a full recognition now by particularly large businesses that they can't continue to do business that way. It's too competitive. They now have to design the infrastructure. So when you look at this voluntary regime that we've proposed on the legislation, they have to prove that they're doing the right thing, but not only to us, but to the public at large. And what better way to drive a business and say your customers out there know that you're doing the right thing or you're not doing the right thing? That makes it more than just a voluntary effort that we're putting forward.
And finally, Mr. Schmidt, now that the proposals are on the table, legislation has been introduced or up in Congress right now, being looked at by committees. What about your future? Are you planning on sticking around at the White House to see this through, or home to Seattle?
Well, I serve at the pleasure of the president, and best I can see, there's no shortage of work for us to continue to do in the future. So I look forward to continuing to serve the president and to indeed move these things forward that he's put on his agenda.
Howard Schmidt, White House Cybersecurity Coordinator, Special Assistant to the President. Thank you for being on the Communicators. Siobhan Gorman, Intelligence Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you as well. This has been week one in our 4-week series on cybersecurity. Next week, 2 members of Congress on the legislative proposals. Mac Thornberry, Republican of Texas, Jim Langevin, Democrat of Rhode Island.